Picture this. It's a cold February evening in 1680, and the streets of Paris are packed with spectators. They're not here for a royal parade or a festival. No, they've come to watch a woman burn. Catherine La Voisin, known to all of Paris as La Voisin, stands bound to a stake in the Place de Grève, her face pale but defiant. She's about to pay the ultimate price for crimes that reach far beyond anything the crowd can imagine. Crimes that snake their way through the gilded halls of Versailles itself, touching the king's own bedchamber. But how did a simple fortune teller end up at the center of the most explosive scandal in French history? How did whispers of love, potions, and herbal remedies transform into accusations of mass murder, black magic, and infant sacrifice? And most shocking of all, how many of France's most powerful nobles were secretly visiting this woman in the dead of night, desperate for her deadly services? Welcome to the affair of the poisons, a scandal so vast, so disturbing, that King Louis XIV himself would eventually burn the evidence to protect his court. This is the story of ambition, jealousy, and murder in the age of absolute monarchy, where the price of power was often paid in poison. Our story really begins in 1676, 4 years before La Voisin's execution, with a woman named Marie-Madeleine Marguerite d'Aubray, the Marquise de Brinvilliers. She was everything a French noblewoman should be: beautiful, educated, wealthy, and married to a distinguished officer. But beneath that polished exterior lurked something far darker. The Marquise had a problem. Actually, she had several problems. Her father, Antoine Dreux d'Aubray, was a wealthy civil lieutenant of Paris who controlled the family fortune. Her two brothers stood between her and a larger inheritance. And most inconveniently, all three of them were alive and healthy. Enter her lover, Gaudin de Sainte-Croix, a charming cavalry officer with expensive tastes and questionable morals. When her father discovered the affair and had Sainte-Croix imprisoned in the Bastille, the couple's resentment festered into something lethal. In prison, Sainte-Croix befriended an Italian poisoner named Exili, and suddenly, the Marquise's problems had a solution. What happened next reads like something from a nightmare. Between 1666 and 1670, the Marquise de Brinvilliers systematically poisoned her father and both brothers, watching them die slow, agonizing deaths, while playing the role of devoted daughter and loving sister. She even tested various poisons on hospital patients, disguising herself as a charitable volunteer bringing food to the sick. How many innocent people died from her charity? We'll never know. She almost got away with it. But in 1672, Sainte-Croix died suddenly, possibly from inhaling his own toxic fumes. And when authorities searched his home, they found a locked box. Inside were letters from the Marquise, detailed records of poisons, and a confession. The trial that followed shocked Paris. Here was a noblewoman, someone from the highest ranks of society, who had killed her own family for money. The Marquise fled to England, then to a convent in Liège. But she was eventually tracked down, arrested, and brought back to Paris. On July 16, 1676, after being tortured and forced to confess, she was beheaded and her body burned in the Place de Grève. The Marquise de Brinvilliers case did more than just entertain the Parisian gossip mongers. It terrified them. If a noblewoman could poison her own father and brothers without anyone suspecting, who else might be doing the same? Suddenly, every unexplained death, every sudden illness, every wealthy person who died mysteriously came under suspicion. The paranoia was justified. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered something disturbing. There was an entire underground economy built around poison in Paris. Fortune tellers, midwives, and alchemists were selling what they euphemistically called inheritance powders to clients eager to speed up their inheritances or eliminate romantic rivals. Think about that for a moment. In the City of Light, beneath the splendor of Louis XIV's reign, the age they called the Grand Siècle, when France dominated Europe in art, culture, and military might, people were casually buying poison like they were shopping for bread. Enter Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, the Lieutenant General of Police for Paris. Today, we might call him the Police Commissioner. But that title doesn't capture the scope of his power or his dogged determination. La Reynie had been appointed by Louis XIV himself to clean up Paris, and he took his job seriously. Where others might have been satisfied with executing the Marquise de Brinvilliers and calling it a day, La Reynie kept digging. He had a hunch that this wasn't just about one murderous noblewoman, this was systemic, and he was right. In early 1677, his investigators arrested a woman named Magdalene de Lagrange on charges of forgery. Under interrogation, she revealed something explosive. She knew of a vast network of fortune-tellers and poison sellers operating throughout Paris. They had clients from every level of society, from desperate servants to bored nobles. And they weren't just selling herbs and love charms, they were dealing in death. La Reynie began pulling on that thread, and the entire tapestry started to unravel. His detectives fanned out across Paris, arresting fortune-tellers, interrogating apothecaries, and following the money trail. What they discovered was staggering in scope. One name kept appearing in the interrogations: La Voisin. Catherine La Voisin was a fortune-teller, midwife, and self-proclaimed sorceress who operated from a house in the Villeneuve-sur-Gravois district. But she was more than just another charlatan bilking desperate clients. She was the hub of the entire poison network. La Voisin came from modest origins. Born Catherine Deschays around 1640, she married Antoine Monvoisin, a jeweler and silk merchant who never quite succeeded in business. As the family slipped into debt, Catherine found an alternative career path. She would tell fortunes, mix potions, and provide specialized services to Paris's elite. And what services they were. La Voisin didn't just predict the future. She claimed she could change it. Want your husband to love you again? She had a potion for that. Want your elderly relative to die so you can inherit? She had a powder for that, too. Want to win the king's favor? Well, for the right price, she could arrange a black mass in your honor. Her house became a destination for desperate women, and it was mostly women, from across Paris, and even from Versailles. Carriages would arrive at all hours, their occupants veiled and anonymous, seeking La Voisin's help with matters they couldn't take to a priest or a doctor. On the surface, La Voisin cultivated an image of respectability. She dressed well, owned property, and mingled with the wealthy. But underneath that facade, she was running a criminal empire. She worked with a network of accomplices. Poisoners like Marie Beauce and Françoise Filastre, priests willing to perform blasphemous rituals for money, and suppliers who could obtain exotic toxins. By 1679, La Reynie had enough evidence. On March 12th, police raided La Voisin's home and arrested her. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears: packets of powder, suspicious herbs, and, most damning, a list of clients that read like a who's who of French aristocracy. King Louis XIV faced a dilemma. The investigation had uncovered evidence of widespread poisoning among his nobility, but pursuing it fully meant potentially implicating some of the most powerful families in France, including people close to him. Very close to him. Louis made a decision that would define the entire affair. He established a special tribunal called the Chambre Ardente, the Burning Chamber, so named for the black cloth and torches that decorated the courtroom. This wasn't a regular court. It operated outside normal legal procedures, could use torture to extract confessions, and answered only to the king. The court opened on April 10, 1679, presiding judges carefully selected by Louis himself. La Reynie would lead the investigation, feeding evidence to the tribunal. The message was clear: The king wanted answers, and he wanted them quickly. Over the next 3 years, the Chambre Ardente held 210 sessions. It issued 319 arrest warrants. It called hundreds of witnesses, and it heard testimony so shocking, so depraved, that even the hardened judges were disturbed. The accused ranged from street-level fortune-tellers to wealthy nobles. Many were women, and their stories painted a disturbing picture of the pressures and limitations faced by women in 17th century France. Unable to divorce abusive husbands, unable to inherit property on equal terms with men, unable to pursue lovers without risking scandal. Some turned to poison as their only form of power. But let's be clear, whatever sympathy we might feel for their circumstances, what they did was murder. The testimony revealed dozens, possibly hundreds of deaths. Men poisoned by their wives, wives poisoned by their husbands, elderly relatives dispatched to speed up inheritances, romantic rivals eliminated, unwanted infants killed. La Voisin herself faced over 200 charges. Under interrogation, which included torture, she confessed to selling poisons and performing black masses. She described rituals that were both blasphemous and horrifying. Masses performed over naked women, chalices filled with blood, and according to some accounts, sacrifices of infants. How much of this was true, and how much was extracted through torture or invented for shock value? Historians still debate that question. Torture was routine in 17th century French courts, and people said anything to make it stop. But Lorraine and his investigators didn't rely solely on confessions. They had physical evidence, witnesses, and the bodies kept piling up. One by one, the lesser players were convicted. Marie Bosse, a fortune-teller and poison supplier, was sentenced to death. So was Françoise Filastre, who had helped La Voisin with her operations. Priests who had performed black masses were arrested, defrocked, and punished. February 22, 1680. The day Paris would never forget. La Voisin was brought to the Place de Grève to be executed by burning, the traditional punishment for poisoning and witchcraft. Huge crowds gathered to watch. Contemporary accounts describe her behavior as defiant to the end. She allegedly pushed aside the priest who came to hear her final confession, shouting that she had no need of God's mercy. Whether this was genuine defiance, madness from fear, or propaganda designed to portray her as irredeemably evil, we can't know. But it made for compelling theater. The fire was lit. La Voisin died without revealing everything she knew. And that's the key phrase here. Everything she knew. Because the evidence suggests that right up until the flames consumed her, she was protecting her most powerful clients. And Lorraine knew it. With La Voisin dead, you might think the affair would have ended. It didn't. In fact, it was about to get worse, much worse. Because now other prisoners, seeing La Voisin's fate, started talking. And the names they mentioned made Lorraine go pale. La Voisin's daughter, Marie-Marguerite Monvoisin, provided testimony that sent shockwaves through Versailles. She named specific nobles who had visited her mother. She described what they wanted: love potions, aphrodisiacs, poisons for rivals. And then she mentioned a name that made the entire investigation grind to a near halt: Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, Marquise de Montespan. Madame de Montespan wasn't just any noble. She was the king's official mistress, the maîtresse en titre. For nearly 13 years, she had been one of the most powerful women in France, bearing Louis XIV 7 children, and wielding enormous influence over court appointments, military decisions, and state policy. Courtiers bowed to her. Foreign ambassadors courted her favor. She lived in apartments at Versailles, second only to the Queen's, and according to La Voisin's daughter and other witnesses, she was a client, a regular client. The accusations were explosive. Witnesses claimed that Madame de Montespan had purchased love potions to keep the king's affections, that she had commissioned black masses, performed naked on an altar, while a defrocked priest consecrated the host over her body, that she had sought to poison Louise de la Vallière, the king's previous mistress, and Marie-Angélique de Scoraille, a young woman who briefly caught Louise's eye. Was it true? The evidence was circumstantial but disturbing. It was established that Madame de Montespan had known La Voisin. They had met multiple times. It was established that strange powders had appeared in the king's food, and that Louis had suffered mysterious illnesses during the height of Montespan's influence. And it was established that Montespan was desperate to maintain her position as the king's favorite, even as she aged and younger women caught his eye. Louis XIV found himself in an impossible position. If he allowed the investigation to continue and Montespan was formally accused, the scandal would destroy the monarchy's reputation. The mother of his children he had legitimized and brought into the royal family, would be revealed as a poisoner and practitioner of black magic. But if he shut down the investigation, he would be protecting potential murderers. And he would never know for certain whether the woman who shared his bed had tried to poison him. In July 1682, Louis made his decision. He ordered the Chambre Ardente to cease operations. He had all records related to Montespan and other high-ranking nobles sealed. He commuted many death sentences to life imprisonment, but rather than regular prisons, he had the condemned sent to remote fortresses where they would be held in isolation, unable to speak to anyone about what they knew. Over 440 people had been charged. 36 had been executed. Many more would spend the rest of their lives in silent imprisonment. And the truth about what really happened, about who was guilty and who was innocent, would be buried for over 2 centuries. Although never formally charged, Madame de Montespan's position at court became untenable. Louis XIV gradually distanced himself from her. He stopped visiting her chambers. He stopped consulting her on matters of state. By 1691, she had been effectively banished from court, retiring to a convent where she would spend her final years in religious devotion, whether from genuine repentance or simply as the price of avoiding prison, we'll never know. Her replacement was very different. Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon, a deeply religious woman who had been governess to Louis's illegitimate children. Louis would secretly marry her after Queen Marie-Thérèse's death in 1683, ushering in a more austere, religious phase of his reign. The age of scandal had ended, at least officially. What happened to those who were imprisoned rather than executed? This is where the affair of the poisons gets even darker. The king had many of them sent to fortress prisons in remote parts of France, where they were held in complete isolation. They couldn't speak to guards. They couldn't write letters. They couldn't see other prisoners. Some historians believe the legendary Man in the Iron Mask, a mysterious prisoner held in isolation for decades, was actually connected to the poison affair, someone who knew too much about what had happened at Versailles. These prisoners would die in their cells, their stories untold, their names erased from history. Louis XIV wanted to ensure that the full truth of the affair died with them. So what do we actually know 3.5 centuries later? The facts are these. There was a widespread poison network operating in Paris during the 1670s. People, mostly women from the nobility and wealthy merchant class, were purchasing poisons to murder family members, rivals, and romantic obstacles. La Voisin and her associates provided these services, along with fortune-telling and occult rituals. The number of victims is unknown, but it was substantial. The investigation identified dozens of definite poisoning cases and many more suspected ones. Some historians estimate the death toll in the hundreds. As for the involvement of high-ranking nobles like Madame de Montespan, here the evidence gets murky. She definitely knew La Voisin. She definitely consulted her. But did she commission black masses and attempt to poison rivals? The testimony came from torture-induced confessions and from people who had every incentive to implicate powerful figures. Yet the king himself clearly believed there was enough truth to the accusations that he needed to shut down the investigation. Modern historians remain divided. Some believe Montespan was guilty, pointing to the consistency of the testimony and the king's reaction. Others think she was the victim of malicious gossip and forced confessions, a convenient scapegoat for a scandal that needed a famous face. Understanding the affair of the poisons requires understanding the world that produced it. This was Ancien Régime France, a society built on rigid hierarchy where your birth determined your entire life. Women, especially, were trapped in impossible situations. A noble woman couldn't choose her husband. Her family chose for her, usually based on political and financial considerations. She couldn't divorce him, no matter how abusive or cruel he was. She couldn't control her own money or property. That belonged to her husband. She couldn't inherit equally with her brothers. She couldn't have a profession or live independently. For women trapped in these circumstances, poison offered a terrible kind of power. It was quiet, difficult to detect, and could be administered by anyone with access to the victim's food or drink. In a world where women had almost no legal avenues for change, some chose an illegal one. This doesn't excuse murder, but it does help explain why so many of the accused were women, and why so many of them were trying to kill husbands, fathers, or brothers, the men who controlled their lives. But the affair wasn't just about desperate women and murder. It was also deeply political. Louis XIV's absolute monarchy required an image of perfect order and control. The Sun King supposedly ruled by divine right. His court, a glittering reflection of heaven on earth. The poison affair shattered that image. It revealed that beneath the gilded surface of Versailles, there was corruption, paranoia, and violence. It showed that the king's own mistress might have been involved in black magic and murder. It demonstrated that the French aristocracy was not a class of refined nobles, but a nest of would-be poisoners. Louis's decision to suppress the investigation was about more than protecting Madame de Montespan. It was about protecting the monarchy itself. If the full truth came out, people might start asking dangerous questions about whether this system of absolute power was really ordained by God, or just a pretty lie covering up something rotten. The affair of the poisons had lasting effects on French society. Louis XIV enacted strict new laws regulating the sale of poisons and toxic substances. Apothecaries faced heavy penalties for selling certain chemicals. The practice of fortune-telling and occult services was suppressed. More subtly, the affair contributed to the growing skepticism about the nobility that would eventually fuel the French Revolution a century later. The aristocracy had been revealed as corrupt and murderous, willing to kill their own family members for money and power. That image would linger in popular memory. And what about La Voisin? In death, she became a legendary figure, the Witch of Paris, her story told and retold in increasingly sensational terms. Was she really a practitioner of dark magic, sacrificing babies to Satan? Or was she just a clever con artist who told wealthy people what they wanted to hear and sold them poison when that's what they wanted to buy? The truth is probably somewhere in between. She was a criminal who profited from murder, certainly, but she was also a product of her time, a time when people believed in magic, when medicine and superstition were indistinguishable, when the line between fortune-telling and fraud was blurry at best. The affair of the poisons ended in 1682, but its questions remain unanswered. How many people really died? How many of the accused were actually guilty? What did Madame de Montespan really do? What secrets did Louis XIV take to his grave? We'll never know for certain. The king saw to that, burning records and silencing witnesses. But perhaps that uncertainty is itself a form of justice, not for the victims, but for us, the historians and armchair detectives still picking through the evidence 3 centuries later. What we can say is this: the affair of the poisons reveals something fundamental about power, gender, and desperation in the early modern world. It shows us what happens when people are trapped in impossible situations with no legal recourse. It demonstrates how easily justice can be corrupted when the powerful are implicated. And it reminds us that even the most glittering palaces can hide the darkest secrets. In the end, La Voisin burned, but the poison she sold seeped into the foundations of the French monarchy itself. The Sun King's court would never shine quite as brightly again. And somewhere in the sealed archives of Versailles, in documents that wouldn't be opened for 200 years, the truth waited in the darkness, patient, silent, and deadly as the powders La Voisin once sold to her desperate, murderous clients. That's the real horror of the affair of the poisons. Not just that it happened, but that even now, we can't be entirely sure how deep the rot really went. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what Louis XIV intended all along.